Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 6th of May 2024. I forgot what year we were in there. Right, let's go first to this bit of news. So officers of the Ukrainian Post Services company Meest in the UK and Spain have been set on fire. In the UK, it was established that it was an arson ordered by Russia, and 5 men are facing charges. Just some examples of Russian sabotage in Europe, and the Times have written on this. In UK firm hit by Wagner plot arson attack also suffered fire in Spain. We're going to remain on this subject for the next few tabs here. So NATO has warned Germany of an intensified Russian spy network. In particular, Russian agents are expected to prepare for sabotage, violent attacks and cyber attacks. The letter notes that the allies are, quote, extremely concerned about Russia's activity on NATO territory. This is Russia ramping up subterfuge, espionage and essentially warlike activities on foreign soil. And the European Commissioner is looking to sanction the Voice of Europe media outlet. This is the one involved in the payments that ended up going to certain politicians in the EU and involved in the whole disinformation as well as, I guess, bribing or paying off European politicians. The EU executive body is proposing that the Voice of Europe media outlet be added to the upcoming 14th round of EU sanctions against Russia. The Vice President of the European Commission, Vera Jourova, said on May the 5th, as reported by European Pravda, and that would be no surprise. I mean, that should be an obvious one to do. Now, I'm going to actually read you this Financial Times article here because it talks about all of these, brings these threads together. And I was thinking of dipping into bits and pieces of this, and I thought, no, I think you need to know all of this. So, Russia plotting sabotage across Europe, intelligence agency warns. Assessments suggest Kremlin agents are preparing covert bombings, arson, and attacks on infrastructure. So, European intelligence agencies have warned their governments that Russia is plotting violent acts of sabotage across the continent as it commits to a course of permanent conflict with the West. Russia has already begun to more actively prepare covert bombings, arson attacks and damage to infrastructure on European soil, directly and via proxies, and with little apparent concern about causing civilian fatalities, intelligence officials believe. While the Kremlin's agents have a long history of such operations and launched attacks sporadically in Europe in recent years, evidence is mounting to a more aggressive and concerted effort, according to assessments from 3 different European countries shared with the Financial Times. Intelligence officials are becoming increasingly vocal about the threat in an effort to promote vigilance. Quote, we assess the risk of state-controlled acts of sabotage to be significantly increased, said Thomas Haldenwang, head of German domestic intelligence. Russia now seems comfortable carrying out operations on European soil, quote, with a high potential for damage. He told a security conference last month, hosted by his agency. Sorry, I'm being so childish. And this is a really serious topic as well, but I just wasn't prepared for that. The Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution. Okay, Holden Wang spoke just days after 2 German-Russian nationals were arrested in Bayreuth, Bavaria, for allegedly plotting to attack military and logistics sites in Germany on behalf of Russia. 2 men were charged in the UK in late April with having started a fire at a warehouse containing aid shipments for Ukraine. English prosecutors accused them of working for the Russian government. So I reported on that recently, and it's just incredible that the Russians have seemingly paid off some people some locals in UK to burn down some Ukrainian-linked infrastructure. That is just a form of open war on British territory. It's just incredible. In Sweden, security services are meanwhile investigating a series of recent railway derailments, which they suspect may be acts of state-backed sabotage. Russia has attempted to destroy the signalling systems on Czech railways, the country's transport minister told Financial Times last month. In Estonia, an attack on the interior minister's car in February and those of journalists were perpetrated by Russian intelligence operatives, the country's internal security services said. France's Ministry of Defense also warned this year of possible sabotage attacks by Russia on military sites. Quote, the obvious conclusion is that there have been a real stepping up of Russian activity, said Keir Giles, senior consulting fellow at Chatham House, the think tank. One cannot tell if that's a reflection of the fact that Russians are throwing more resources at it, whether they are being more sloppy and getting caught, or whether Western counterintelligence has simply become better at detecting and stopping it, he added. Whatever it is, though, there is a lot going on. Now, my analysis of this is that is a quite dangerous game for the Russians to play. They are playing an information war in Europe, and they are trying to manipulate the information spaces so that there are sentiments against allied nations who are supporting Ukraine. And I think some of this is counterproductive for Russia. So if I was Russia, I'd be very careful about sanctioning moves that would generate overt, and fairly obviously so, sentiments against Russia. So if you're going to play havoc with the railway and the nation can clearly detect that it is you, Russia, that is doing that maybe through proxies, then whatever side of the fence you sit on in that country, you're going to be pretty pissed off that Russia is interfering with your life, with your nation's infrastructure, and that's not going to go down well in terms of garnering sympathy for Russia. So, interesting. One senior European government official said information was being shared through NATO's security services of, quote, clear and convincing Russian mischief, which was coordinated and at scale. That word mischief, I think, is such an understatement and probably a little bit counterproductive. The time has come to, quote, raise awareness and focus about the threat of Russian violence on European soil, he added. So mischief and violence, I think, are two very different words. NATO issued a statement on Thursday declaring its deep concern about growing malign activities on Allied territory, end quote, by Russia, citing what it said was an, quote, intensifying campaign across the Euro-Atlantic area, end quote. The growing fears over Russia's appetite for physical damage against its adversaries follow a spate of accusations against Russia over disinformation and hacking campaigns. On Friday, Germany vowed consequences for Moscow in a statement backed by the EU and NATO over a 2023 hacking attack on the Social Democratic Party of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, a scandal exposing Russian attempts to co-opt far-right European politicians ahead of upcoming European elections is meanwhile still unfolding. One intelligence official said Moscow's sabotage efforts should not be seen as distinct from other operations, saying the ramp up in activity reflected Russia's aim to exert maximum pressure, quote, across the piece. Putin is currently feeling emboldened and will seek to push lines as hard as he can in Europe on multiple fronts, he said, whether through disinformation, sabotage or hacking. Increased aggression from Russian intelligence also reflects the desire for the country's spy masters to reassert themselves after their most serious setback since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the weeks following Russia's full-scale invasion of Europe, more than 600 Russian intelligence officers operating in Europe with diplomatic cover were ejected, dealing serious damage to the Kremlin spy network across the continent. In recent reports, analysts at the UK's Royal United Services Institute highlighted the efforts to which Russia had gone to reconstitute its presence in Europe, often using proxies. Those include members of the Russian diaspora, as well as organised crime groups with which the Kremlin has long-standing ties. A key strategic shift has also occurred with so-called committees of special influence coordinating intelligence operations country by country for the Kremlin, drawing together what were previously piecemeal efforts by the country's fractious security services and other Kremlin players. And just to finish, with Russia's stepping up of operations, security services have been on high alert over threats and are looking to identify targets they may have missed. Questions have been raised, for instance, over a so far unexplained explosion at a BAE Systems munitions factory in Wales that supplies shells used by Ukraine. Interesting, there were rumours, or people were speculating early doors about the explosion in the BAE Systems factory, that it was linked maybe to Russia. There was a fire in two, I think, facilities, one in the Scranton, Pennsylvania facility in the US. So maybe Russia are having some success even within countries where you'd expect them not to be able to access those kind of facilities. In October 2014, a Czech arms depot where weapons for Kyiv were stored were being stored was destroyed. Russian military intelligence agents were later revealed to have planted explosives at the site. A huge fire broke out on Friday at a factory in Berlin owned by the arms company Diehl, which also supplies Ukraine. More than 160 specialist firefighters were called to tackle the blaze, with residents in a huge swath of the west of the capital told to keep windows closed due to possible toxic fumes. I didn't report that, and the reason I didn't is because it was misreported at the start that it was a Diehl defense munitions factory. It's actually a Diehl metal factory that helps provide equipment for the automotive industry. Whether that can be connected to Russia, I don't know. Quote, as ever with Russia, it's wise not to look for a single explanation why they are doing anything. There's always a combination of things going on, said Giles. These pinprick attacks we've seen so far are, of course, to create disruption, but they can be used for disinformation. And then there is what Russia learns from these attacks if they want to immobilize Europe for real. Their practice runs. End quote. This is scary stuff. So, we need to be on edge. We need to be under no illusions who the bad guys are in this conflict, not only with the Ukraine, but the notion that they are fighting against all of us in Europe, in the US, allies to Ukraine. This is, as I've said, a big game of 4D chess. China are involved in that game, as are North Korea and Iran. We need to be aware that we are involved in that game. I think our general public are not aware enough of what is going on. And here is a more obvious manifestation of this. It's incredible, says Marco Mikkelsen. There should be zero tolerance for Europe for such genocidal war glorifying demonstrations. What's he referring to? Well, Sergei Sumleny here says, in Madrid, local Russian community marched with the flags of genocidal USSR and terrorist entities, Luhansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republic. Note that these Russians are young and live in a free society. They demonstrate freely and they totally support terrorists. That would annoy the bejesus out of me. I wouldn't be able to hold back if I was in Madrid at that time. Absolute shocker. Right, European Commission is ready to unveil a proposal to ban the resale of Russian liquefied natural gas in EU ports. This is massive. Commission will also request restrictions on 3 future Russian LNG projects. These measures will be part of Brussels' 14th sanctions package. That's going to be will have a bigger impact on Russia on their ability to generate income to fund the war. It'll also provide some headaches for Europeans who rely very much on energy coming from Russian LNG. So hopefully there's enough supply available to overcome those issues. Right, Russian Foreign Ministry has threatened the Baltic states with sanctions in response to hostility. Moscow plans to impose economic and transit sanctions on Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia for, quote, hostile actions towards Russia, according to Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova. Don't know what they will be. But they are being touted there. For Victory Day celebrations in Moscow, so May the 9th is a big day in the Russian calendar. Putler, so that's a mixture of Putin and Hitler, is often called Putler. Putler has invited world leaders to commemorate the end of World War II. So in days gone past, there have been some fairly significant world leaders that have turned up to the Victory Day celebrations. Who's been invited this time round? The president of Tajikistan, the president of Kazakhstan, president of Laos, and the president of Guinea-Bissau. Okay, well done there. Good effort. Check who your friends are. Xi Jinping is to visit, he is in France right now, and then Hungary and Serbia. This tells you all you need to know about China and what they are trying to do geopolitically speaking. Are they just paying lip service to the EU by visiting France and then going to Hungary and Serbia to try and generate antipathy for the EU by move Hungary away from the EU or become a destabilizing entity within the EU and send Serbia in the other direction? Anyway, amid the EU trade tariff row, Xi Jinping is going to visit, or is in China. Is in France. China's president arrives as EU anti-subsidy investigations and tensions over espionage, Ukraine and Taiwan continue. This will be the first visit by a Chinese leader to Europe in 5 years. And indeed, he has arrived in France. The head of China said that during his visit to France, he will discuss relations between the two countries as well as important regional and international issues with the French leader Emmanuel Macron. Indeed, they are meeting at the moment. The French president said that parties will discuss commercial issues, access to markets, conditions of fair competition, investments, harmonious development. Quote, and secondly, we'll discuss Ukraine and the Middle East, two major crises in which coordination between us is absolutely crucial, Macron has added. The meeting will be attended by the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. So hopefully something positive will come out of that before he goes off to Hungary and Serbia. As far as Emmanuel Macron is concerned, he's been in the news quite a bit recently. Here is, I forget where this is taken from. Is it La Tribune? An exclusive there. So the quote, these are all quotes from Macron. The capability and range of Russian ballistic missiles put us all at risk. Strategic ambiguity means not giving too many details. Russia, as a strategic power, no longer gives us any visibility. So why should we give them any? I add. Quite right. Russia decided unilaterally in February 2022 to attack a sovereign state, Ukraine, and therefore not to respect international law, the Charter of the United Nations. At the beginning, Russia had a declared strategic objective. Russia claimed to save Ukrainian provinces, oblasts, that had declared their autonomy. That's over. It's out of that framework. Russia has decided to become a destabilizing force with no strategic limits. President Putin has constantly brandished the nuclear threat. Faced with such an adversary, what weakness to set limits a priori? What weakness? So in other words, we shouldn't set limits. We shouldn't give ourselves a red line because it shows us as having weaknesses. It is weak. And he's absolutely right. To continue, on the contrary, we must remove all visibility from it because that is what creates the ability to deter. The security of Europeans is at stake in Ukraine because it is 1,500 kilometers from our borders. If Russia wins in the second round, there will be no security in Romania, in Poland, in Lithuania, nor in our country. So strong rhetoric again from Emmanuel Macron there. Good stuff. Now, here we have a riposte to Emmanuel Macron and his positioning and his strong rhetoric on Ukraine. And this is coming from Marine Le Pen. If you remember, or if you know, Marine Le Pen is the leader of Rassemblement National, the French National Rally, which is the latest iteration of Front National, the National Front, the right wing. Her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was in charge of the National Front, basically. And that was seen as obviously like extremist fringe right wing, because it was. And so over time, they've tried to inch their way into more moderate thinking, but retaining that extreme, like just you push yourself, you mold yourself to what you think is more acceptable more and more until you reach a critical point where, or a tipping point where actually some of the disaffected of the electorate find it socially acceptable to join that party. You could argue that's happened in Britain with what used to be the National Front, became the BNP, English Democrats, and then you could argue that the elements, and I'm not trying to diss like UKIP or whatever, but there were elements of those thinking in parties that took that and made it more palatable. There's a really interesting article recently that I was reading that said, funnily enough, what the Conservatives are advocating now openly, and what one of the main reform Ben Habib guys in the Reform Party, which is kind of the latest iteration of UKIP, is literally what the BNP, the British National Party, were advocating 15 years ago and got trounced for it. Got like, that's really racist and horrible, and the whole thing with Rwanda, although it's just a bit of a big cock up, the way that they've done all that, it's just is seemed to be an example of where what was unacceptable, say 20 years ago, has been made more palatable to become more acceptable now. But also that society has shifted to see some of these ideas as more acceptable in and of themselves. So there are interesting ways of understanding the move, particularly of the far right, in European and British politics, and indeed American politics, I would argue. So Marine Le Pen here, and this is not, of course, to say that there aren't issues that are genuine bona fide issues that the electorate are incensed about or concerned about in France that do need to be addressed, that her party is seeking to address. But I think it's a very dangerous party, and I think it's at base it has influence from Russia. We know of connections of Rassemblement National to Russia, and it's also about Euroscepticism and disuniting Europe. And I think when you are looking at the future with, where we're going to be in 10, 20 years time with regard to China and Russia and other global players, I think it's absolutely fundamental that we have a European unity that the EU maintains to stand up to democratically stand up to those autocratic regimes. And so whatever you think about the EU, so say you're a British Leave voter who wanted sovereignty or whatever the reason was that you wanted out of the EU, I think there's still a huge case to be made to still, I think you can be a Leave voter and still recognise that the EU is absolutely vital the EU maintains. Because without the EU, Europe is just easy pickings individually for Russia, for China, etc., etc. The strength of standing up, the only, I think, serious chance of standing up to autocracy going forward, given that the US is in an interesting place, is the EU. Anyway, she says, Marine Le Pen says, when we say with a glass of whiskey in our hand to a singer with whom we are chatting at 3 a.m, I have to send some guys to Odessa. Yes, I'm talking about not being serious. Macron wants to send troops for a matter of ego and personal image. She's having a right go at him as like, just hanging out with famous people and talking, and then making huge decisions about sending French troops to Ukraine whilst, sipping whiskey and talking to singers and whatnot. For Marine Le Pen, says French aid to Ukraine, Emmanuel Macron is not serious about the war in Ukraine. I completely disagree. I think it is every bit of evidence suggests that he knows exactly what's going on, and he is deeply serious. In fact, I've been listening to a lot of analysts who are saying, he's really woken up and he is a really important component in support for Ukraine going forward. Quote, we do not want Ukraine to join the European Union. We do not want Ukraine to join NATO. This is Marine Le Pen. And we do not want to share our nuclear deterrent on a European level and send troops into a war that's not France's. So it's very obvious where she's positioning herself. And annoyingly, her party, the French National Rally, is going to pick up a huge number of, or comparatively large number of seats, if the polls are to be trusted, going into the European parliamentary elections in June. This is a real challenge because you will get a growing support for Russia inside Europe going forward, because it's all mixed with the kind of right-wing resurgence in Europe that is concerned probably primarily with immigration and those issues. They are then amplified by Russia, and those grievances that people have are co-opted by Russia, and then they add on issues like being anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia. And so you go with them on immigration and you end up being sucked into these other larger ideas on geopolitics that are counterproductive to European unity and to global security. Anyway, going on to Georgia, I don't know too much about what's happening in Georgia right now as far as protests are going. I haven't seen any big protest footage over the last 24 hours, so I don't know if the protests have finished for now. But I love this TikTok video here. We've also got water cannon. As I said, you can't defeat them. This is a game for them, says the Dead District, who himself, I think the Dead District is a source I referred to a lot, is Georgian. And he went to the protests as well. He showed like his ski mask that he got and whatnot. This is a woman being shot at by a water cannon, and then has her as a water pistol, and it's like it's obvious, like she's not obviously doing anything, but it's just a way of saying, yeah, I may only have a water pistol, you may have a water cannon, but I'm still going to resist you because the strength of my feelings is greater than the strength of your water cannon, and I love that. Brilliant. So in that regard, though, the US State Department has reminded Georgian authorities who is dragging them into war. or into war. Yeah, quote: "It is Russia that is dragging Georgia into the war in Ukraine. Russia is starting to build a giant military port on the territory of Georgia it occupies, and that's in Abkhazia. And I've talked about that before. Plans are afoot there on the Black Sea coast to build a port that will effectively be able to replace Sevastopol, because Novorossiysk is not deep enough and not good enough as a port to do what the Russians want it to do. And if Sevastopol is compromised, then they are building it on another area of land that they stole off another country, which is in Abkhazia. Abductions and sometimes murders of Georgian citizens continue as Russia continues to occupy the territory," said the US Assistant Secretary Jim O'Brien. And I think it's important we recognise what is going on in Georgia, and we support as much as possible those who are advocating for Georgian democracy and for continuing their objectives with regard to joining, for example, the European Union. Anton Gerashchenko says, and this is referring, I said I'd dip back into this, Hakeem Jeffries, a minority leader in the House of Representatives in the US Congress. So remember, you got the president, you've got the Senate of 100 senators and 438 representatives in the House of Representatives. At the moment, the Republicans have a 1-seat majority. Hakeem Jeffries is if you like, the speaker, or he's the leader for the minority. He's not speaker, he's a minority leader for the Democrats, and he's on point on Ukraine. He was interviewed by 60 Minutes on CBS last night, and it was good stuff that he said. So, quote: "We cannot allow Ukraine to fall," said Hakeem Jeffries. He did not rule out sending US troops to help the armed forces of Ukraine, which is massive. "We can't let Ukraine fall, because if it does, then there's a significant likelihood that America will have to get into the conflict, not simply with our money, with our servicewomen and servicemen," he told CBS News. He believes that Putin seeks to recreate the Soviet Union and thus will threaten NATO allies. Putin will not stop at Ukraine alone. There is a growing pro-Putin faction in the Republican Party who do not want to support Ukraine, and they believe that Russia is not an enemy of the US. And the Ukrainian military held off Russian forces for over 2 years, and it is a strategic success by any definition. Those who want to convince the American people that the Ukrainian effort has failed are contributing to Putin's propaganda, because the facts say otherwise. So this is really good stuff. This is what I want to hear from both sides of the aisle in US politics, which is, good, rational support for Ukraine and a strength of rhetoric that befits what the US should be doing continually. Okay, going on to Biden and Israel. Biden's in a really precarious position with regard to Israel. It's very similar to what I said the other day in my British politics video about the local elections that just took place and how Labour are going to be challenged. I think, the Conservatives are not going to get in the next general election, according to every analyst and bit of data. But how big the Labour win is, or whether they will definitely get a majority, or whether they have to form a coalition government with the Lib Dems or whatever, is going to be defined by two things. One, how big Reform are in taking votes from the Conservatives, and two, how Labour play the Israel-Gaza thing. Because conflict, because there are a number of areas, particularly in the north of the UK, where there are a lot of Muslim voters and also some young voters as well, student voters who are pro-Palestine and anti-Israel in their offensive war against what they see predominantly as attacks on civilians. And so, as Keir Starmer for Labour came out and said, right, we are going to support Israel initially at the beginning, because you've got to wonder, and I didn't really go into this, but Labour were attacked under Jeremy Corbyn as being anti-Semitic, right? Because they have a lot of candidates or politicians and council members and MPs and whatnot who are Muslim, particularly from the north of the UK. And as with America, with Catholic Hispanic immigrants coming from South America as immigrants into the US, the tradition is that they end up joining the Democrats in the US, or having, I won't say more in common, because this is my point, they don't have more in common. They end up joining the Democrats because they are kind of oppressed minorities, and same with Muslims, is they join the Labour Party. But the thing is, culturally, observant Muslims are much more likely to be social conservatives. And so realistically, actually Muslims have a lot more in common with the Conservative Party in the UK, oddly enough. And actually, I'd argue the same in the US in terms of what they believe about social matters and pro-life and religion and so on and so forth. Actually, those first-generation migrants who come in are invariably sort of strong Catholics and will actually have a lot more in common with many of the Republican policies. So you get this really weird, interesting situation in both countries. But anyway, in terms of the UK, Keir Starmer has to play it very, very carefully because he wants to not be seen as anti-Semitic because the Tories had a go at them for that under Corbyn. Because of there's quite a bit of Muslim influence inside the party. But now they also need to recognise that those Muslims inside the party and the young people, many young people, many students and whatnot, are against the Labour's position, which would be seen to be appeasing Israel. And so they might lose a lot of those voters off to, say, the Green Party or other parties who are pro peace deal, ceasefire and whatnot. So they need to play that really carefully. And the Democrats absolutely need to play that carefully in America, where it's exactly the same. They could lose a lot of their progressive voters off to voting third party, someone like RFK Jr., or just spoiling the ballots or whatever. It's unlikely they'd vote Republican because the Republicans are very staunchly pro-Israel. So with the Democrats, you got to the right and the centre and to the right of the party, you have a lot of people who will still associate more with Israel than with Palestine. But to the left of the party, you have more that associate with Palestine and Israel. And it's such a divisive issue that this could hamstring. This is what Biden's particularly worried about, is in certain areas where the margins are tiny, electorally speaking, and it's only about 7 or 8 different states really in the US that are going to decide the election. Those margins are tiny, and if they lose them either to third party or spoiled ballots, then that is potentially losing the election. So Biden has to play this really, really carefully. Now, he's apparently put on hold an ammunition shipment to Israel, according to Axios. The Biden administration last week put a hold on a shipment of US-made ammunition to Israel, according to 2 Israeli officials. It's the first time since October the 7th attack that the US has stopped a weapons shipment intended for the Israeli military. So how will that go down across the electorate in the US? And Axios do a really good kind of summary analysis of this in bullet points. And as it says here, look, the next article is Biden faces new Democratic pressure to rein in Israel. This is really important for what's going on in the Middle East, and it also, affects other countries as well, or other countries are affecting this calculation in that neck of the woods. I won't go through it, but this has a huge impact on the electability of Biden and the Democrats, and then that will have a knock-on effect as to the continued support for Ukraine. So that's the reason I'm including that in this geopolitical news update. And it won't be the same in the UK, because I think in the UK you've got broad bipartisan support or cross-party support for Ukraine, and so I don't think. But in the US, this is much more of a risk. And so we need to keep an eye on how Biden deals with the Israel-Gaza problem. And it really, honestly, is such a headache because it is so complex, and both sides have done bad things. And how do you, as the US, try and negotiate a solution to this problem where neither side particularly want a solution? How do you come out that taking the maximum amount of your electorate with you, of American voters? Okay, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has held a phone call earlier today with French President Emmanuel Macron, during which Macron stated his firm opposition to a kind of Israel ground invasion of Rafah. So a lot of the problem with what's going on and why the US has supposedly stopped munitions going is because there is this threat of the Israelis going to attack another area. So driving the news, the Biden administration is highly concerned Israel will invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah, where more than 1 million displaced Palestinians have been taking shelter. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released several statements in recent days saying he intended to order the invasion of Rafah regardless of whether Israel and Hamas reach a deal for the release of hostages being held in Gaza and a ceasefire. Netanyahu hinted at tensions with the Biden administration in a statement on Holocaust Remembrance Day. So, this is an issue, and indeed France is recognising Emmanuel Macron here saying, this is an issue. Invasion of Rafah would not be good. And finally, I might do this. I'll do this as an extra later because this will take up a long time. But there's been a Vacnick Soup thread, 24 tweet thread, which I'm looking forward to going through with you on Jabba the Hutt Orban, Viktor Orban, who is such an important player in this in this conflict and in Europe and in the future of the unity in the EU. So look forward to that one at some point. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please take care. Subscribe, like, hit bells, stand on your left leg, wiggle your thumbs. I don't know. Thanks for your help and support. Toodle pips.